Plessy versus Ferguson is a landmark 1896 United States Supreme Court decision which upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. Plessy versus Ferguson is widely regarded as one of the worst decisions in United States Supreme Court history, but despite its infamy, the decision was never explicitly overturned.
Y'all been told that Plessy versus Ferguson was a racist piece of legislation. That's what you've been told.
Was Plessy versus Ferguson a racist piece of legislation? Watch Vince break it down real slow for the people in the back.
Go back to whether segregation was okay or not. This all started with Brown versus Board of Education. Well, it really started with Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson. Yeah, Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a very light-skinned black man. Lived in Louisiana. They wanted to see whether the segregation laws would stand up in the courts. So they had these separate cars on trains for black and white passengers. Well, Homer Plessy went, because he was light-skinned, he went and sat in the white section and nobody bothered him. And then when he told the conductor he was black, the conductor told him to go to the colored part. He wouldn't do it. They arrested Homer. It was all a setup to get to the courts. They paid his bail. They went to the Supreme Court. And Plessy versus Ferguson is infamous because it set up the standard of separate but equal. But Plessy versus Ferguson is interesting. It's interesting because a lot of people try to say that Brown was the good decision, that Plessy was the bad decision. If you read the Cliff Notes from history, that's what it entails. But as I've always told you, history is lies agreed upon. I'm going to read to you what Plessy versus Ferguson said. And Plessy versus Ferguson actually says that black people are not inferior to white people. It actually says that in Supreme Court law. Let me read it to you. This is coming from my book, The Iron Triangle. I'm going to read to you what the Supreme Court said about Plessy versus Ferguson out of the Iron Triangle. All right? Plessy versus Ferguson was in 1896. Okay, this is what it says. Supreme Court is talking here. Justice Brown, this is the Plessy opinion. He said, we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. So he's saying, you are saying that if we separate the two races, it's going to stamp the colored race with a badge of inferiority. He says, we're going to talk about that. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. He said, so if black people feel inferior because of this Supreme Court decision, it is not because of this decision. It's because black people have decided, they decided, not this court, to become inferior. The argument necessarily assumes that if, as has been more than once the case, and is not unlikely to be again, the colored race should become the dominant power in the state legislature and should enact a law precisely in precisely similar terms. It would thereby relegate the white race to the inferior position. So he's saying, so, you know, back in the days of Reconstruction, a lot of black people had control of state legislatures down south. Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana. Supreme Court is saying that it has been in the past in the South a situation where black people were the superior race in the state legislatures. And if they set up a separate but equal system, the question is, would white people feel inferior to black people? That's the question. They said, so if black people, when they had power, if they had done this, do you think white folks would have felt inferior to black folks? That's the question. He said, we imagine that the white race at least would not acquiesce in this assumption. He said, hell no, white folks wouldn't have felt inferior to black people if black people set up a separate but equal system. They wouldn't have. They wouldn't have acquiesced themselves to that position. The argument also assumes that social prejudices may be overcome by legislation and that equal rights cannot be secured to the Negro except by enforced commingling of the two races. He said, so, you guys are also arguing that the only way for black and white people to secure equal rights and that social prejudices be overcome is with legislation, for us passing laws. That's what you assume. This is what the court says. We cannot accept this proposition. And I will be daggum if they're not right. (1896), 1996, 100 years. 2025, 129 years. And we still fighting over the same thing because legislation couldn't fix it. Exactly what the Supreme Court said. A legislation cannot fix this problem. And then it says, if the two races are to meet on terms of social equality, it must be the result of a natural affinity, a mutual appreciation of each other's merits, and a voluntary consent of individuals. Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts, to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences, and the attempt to do so can only result in accentuating the difficulties of the present situations. Well, I tell you what, that Supreme Court had a whole lot of sense, because all it's done is cause Black Lives Matter, NAACP, bunch of lying Democrats go out here, and right now America is one of the most unhappiest countries in the world. You know why? Because they keep this racial division going, because they want to pass more legislation, not less, more, to try to force people to get along. And the Supreme Court said back with Plessy, this cannot be done. The people got to get to know each other. They got to learn to live with each other. They got to learn to live in happiness, and the government cannot make them do that. And then it ends with this. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other, civilly or politically. Now, did you hear what Plessy said? Let me read that to y'all again, because y'all been told that Plessy versus Ferguson was a racist piece of legislation. That's what you've been told. Let me read it to you again. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other, civilly or politically. I thought this was a racist piece of legislation. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other, civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States of America cannot put them upon the same plane. That's right. And since we are not inferior, since no one is superior to the other, the Constitution has no power to make me inferior or superior. That's Plessy.